through carefully the experiment that the Parliamentary Domestic Violence Committee, which my honourable friend chairs, is undertaking at the moment on the use of the internet. It is the case at the moment that some committees use video technology and video conferencing, and it's also the case that the internet is used fairly widely. At the end of the day, these are matters for the committees themselves. But given the advance of technology, I think my honourable friend is right that these developments will continue and increase.
Fiona McTaggart.
Madam Speaker.
Madam Speaker, the total cost this session of staff remaining on duty as a result of sittings after midnight has been approximately £35,000. Overtime costs for police and security staff due to late sittings after midnight totalled £64,000.
But has the House of Commons Commission made any assessment of the impact of these usually unannounced late night sittings on the morale of the people who work in this institution? I know that it makes members of this House do their job less well. I'm quite confident that it makes the people who work in the cafes and the libraries and so on do their job less well. Will he look at its impact on our recruitment and retention of staff who serve us so well?
Madam Speaker, the House of Commons Commission is always very considerate of the needs and demands on staff, particularly in late night sittings. But I can assure the Honourable Lady that they are well-established parts of contracts of employment. The people who come to work here know exactly under which conditions they come to work. I can assure the Honourable Lady that if members have got the long-term interests of staff who are working late at hand, then they won't vote to sit after 10 o'clock at night.
Thank you. Time's up. I have to notify the House, in accordance with the Royal Assent Act 1967, that Her Majesty has signified a royal assent to the following Act: Consolidated Fund Act 2000. Thank you, Bill. May I come? Thank you.
Order, order. Before I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, it may be for the convenience of honourable members if I remind them that at the end of the Chancellor's speech, copies of the budget resolutions will be available to honourable members in the vote office. Mr. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, a year ago, the government forecast the British economy would grow at 1 to 1.5%. Today, I can report that in 1999, instead of the recession that many forecast, the British economy grew by 2%. And Britain has been growing steadily while meeting our inflation target. Today, inflation is 2.2%. For the third year running, inflation is in line with our target. The target of 2.5%, which I reaffirm today, will be met this year, next year, and the year after that. Because of the action we took in 1997 to stop inflation getting out of control, inflation in Britain has now been lower for longer than at any time since the 1960s. For almost 30 years, Britain's long-term interest rates were on average 3% higher than those of Germany. Now British long-term rates are down to the levels of Germany, and today they are lower than those of the USA. Amid the risks of an unstable and often uncertain global economy, we are determined to maintain our disciplined approach. Determined not to make the old British mistakes of paying ourselves too much today at the cost of higher interest rates and fewer jobs tomorrow. Determined not to make the old mistakes of putting consumption before investment, the short term before the long term. Britain does not want a return to boom and bust. That is why the Bank of England has been right to take preemptive action on interest rates and to be vigilant on wage inflation. It is because the foundations on which we build are strong that the economy can both meet our inflation target and achieve steady growth. Our forecast is that growth this year will rise to 2.75% to 3.25%, and next year and the year after that it is forecast to be 2.25% to 2.75%, in line with our view of trend growth. Manufacturing is growing by 1.75% to 2.25% this year and next year. And business investment grew by 7.7% last year to 14.5% of our national income. Since 1998, Britain, for the first time, investing more of our national income than our major European competitors, even more invested as a proportion of national income than America. Now, this budget is built on the realities of the new economy, that we will meet and master a new tide of technological change by continuing to remove the old barriers to investment and enterprise, and by continuing to expand employment opportunity for hard-working families. I can report that unemployment today is at its lowest for 20 years. There are 800,000 more people in work than in 1997, and there are 1 million vacancies on offer. And take-home pay is rising. By next year, for the typical family, a real terms rise in living standards of 10% since 1997. Now, Britain's economic success depends not only on monetary stability, but on fiscal stability. And today I can report that because of the tough decisions to cut the deficit in our first 2 years and lower long-term interest rates, debt interest payments will be £4 billion a year lower. Because of the welfare to work reforms that have cut unemployment, social security spending on economic failure this year is a total of £3 billion less than the plans we inherited. Today, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the state of the public finances is sound. In 1997, we inherited a current deficit exceeding £20 billion. A year ago, I estimated that this year's current surplus would be £2.5 billion. I can report today that we have not only balanced the current budget, but our current surplus this year is forecast to be £17 billion. We have met, and we will continue to meet, even on the most cautious of cases, our first rule of fiscal prudence, the Golden Rule. And we're also meeting our second rule, the Sustainable Investment Rule. This year, debt as a share of national income will fall well below the 44% we inherited to 37.1%. Last year, we forecast that the overall budget would be in deficit for this financial year, that public sector net borrowing would be £3 billion. I can now report that due to the performance of the economy and to prudent management, the budget is not in deficit by £3 billion, it is in surplus by £12 billion. We inherited a deficit of £28 billion. This year, we will make a debt repayment of £12 billion. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, too often in the past, at the first time of a surplus, governments have fallen back into imprudent ways. It is because we have learned from the mistakes of the last 40 years that this government will maintain its prudent and responsible approach. The figures I am announcing today show that we will meet our fiscal rules over the economic cycle. We will meet our fiscal rules even in the most cautious case, on the most cautious assumptions, including the cautious view of trend growth at 2.25%. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can announce today that I have decided to lock in a greater fiscal tightening next year and the year after that than we promised in last year's budget and pre-budget report. After the measures I announced today, our projection is for a current surplus next year of £14 billion. For the years after that, surpluses of plus 16, plus 13, plus 8 and plus 8. Debt to GDP, which was 44% in 1997, will fall to 35% next year, then 34%, and then 33% in each of the next 3 years. Net borrowing will be minus £6.5 billion next year. That is, we will make a debt repayment next year of £6.5 billion. Then net borrowing in 2001 to 2 will be minus 5, a debt repayment of £5 billion, with net borrowing for the years after 2002 to 3 of plus 3, plus 11, plus 13, well within our fiscal rules. So from this stable platform of sound finances, I'm able today to set out our prudent and responsible approach for future years. Having met all our fiscal rules, Having paid off 18 billion of debt this year and next, and locked in a greater fiscal tightening, we are able both to set a new envelope for public spending and investment for the years from 2001 and to cut taxes for hard-working families. I can report that our fiscal rules enable us to increase current public spending by 2.5% a year in real terms for the 3 years from 2001, and to double net public investment as a share of national income from 0.9% next year to 1.8% in 2004. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I've always said that our prudence is for a purpose. And in this budget, because of our continuing prudence, we can now take the next steps towards that purpose, a Britain of opportunity and security, not just for a few, but for all. With stability locked in and enterprise growing, we can meet our prosperity goal to close the productivity gap. With 800,000 more people in jobs and the work ethic being restored in every community, our full employment goal of employment opportunity for all. With 50,000 more students already and standards rising, our education goal, 50% of young people in higher education by 2010. And with 800,000 children already lifted out of poverty and Britain's civic society renewing itself, we can meet our anti-poverty goal to half child poverty by 2010 on the way to ending it by 2020. Now, first, I announce major reforms today to reward enterprise and entrepreneurship, to open up competition in banking, to promote new and growing businesses and e-commerce, and balanced growth across all the regions and nations of the United Kingdom. Now, to remove more of the old barriers to new investment, I've decided on radical reforms of capital gains tax, beyond the tax cuts I set out in the pre-budget report. When we came to government and cut the long-term rate of capital gains tax for business assets held for 10 years or more, capital gains tax had been fixed at 40% for nearly 10 years. I have now decided to promote enterprise that we should radically cut these rates. I'm announcing that from 6th April this year, the new capital gains tax rates for business assets will be cut from 40% to 35% after 1 year, to 30% after 2 years, to 20% after 3 years, and down to 10% after 4 years. And I will make further tax cuts to remove the barriers that hold small and growing businesses back. Today, business investors who own between 5% and 25% of a new and growing business do not benefit from the 10 pence rate. I will now cut the rate to 10% for all investments above 5% held for 4 or more years. I will make a further radical change, this time for Britain's unquoted companies. All investments held for 4 years in them will benefit from the 10% rate. With both the lowest corporate tax rates for businesses ever and the lowest ever capital gains tax rates now for long-term investors, Britain is now the place for companies to start, to invest, to grow and to expand. I have a decision about one other tax on capital, inheritance tax. The threshold for inheritance tax is £231,000. I will raise it next year to £234,000. 96% of people will be exempt from inheritance tax. I have one further cut in capital gains tax to be introduced from 6th April, so that millions more hard-working people have a stake in the businesses whose wealth they create. We will remove the old barriers to a share-owning democracy. The all-employee shareholding schemes, with the best tax incentives on offer, which starts on 6th April this year, has one defining requirement: that shareholding should be open to all employees. I can confirm that the 1.7 million people now in the Save As You Earn scheme will continue to enjoy its benefits. I have also decided that high-tech firms recruiting essential personnel will be able to offer share option incentives of £100,000 for up to 15 employees. The Financial Secretary will now consult on a technical solution to the tax treatment of share options in unapproved schemes. And I can go further. In future, all employee shareholders will secure all the benefits of the 10% capital gains tax rate. Now, taken together, these measures are the biggest boost for employee shareholding that our country has ever seen. It is the next step on our road to a wealth-owning democracy. Yesterday, in response to the Cruikshank report, my right honourable friend, the Secretary for Trade, and I referred small business banking to the Competition Commission. Mr Cruikshank estimated that competition could reduce banking costs and charges by up to 10%, or between £3 and £5 billion a year. The money transmission system affects every cheque, every credit card and every debit transaction. It reaches from every local cash dispenser to every corporate interbank transfer. Today I'm announcing that we will legislate to ensure the UK payment system is open to new competition. Now, the international competitiveness of the bond market in the City of London depends upon a level playing field. That is why today I'm announcing that from April 2001, we will abolish the withholding tax on the interest paid on international bonds. We will legislate so we can proceed on the basis of exchange of information nationally and internationally. This change should be widely welcome in all parts of the House. There is no clearer indication of our determination to stand up for what is right for Britain. Now, since 1997, the numbers of small business in Britain have risen from 1.2 million to 1.3 million, a 100,000 increase. And today I want to continue to remove all barriers to small business growth. Having already cut small business corporation tax from 23% to 20 pence, and for the first 10,000 of profits to just 10%, I'm today making a further tax reduction. For all small and medium-sized businesses, the 40% capital allowances, which I introduced in the 1997 budget, will be made permanent, and this will be of special help to manufacturing companies. Half manufacturing employment is in small and medium-sized firms, so manufacturing will derive further benefit from the £150 million I'm allocating to our new research and development tax credit, which is introduced now on April the 6th to finance 30% of small firms' R&D costs. I want also to make Britain the best environment for e-commerce and for us to catch up with America as swiftly as possible. To encourage 1 million small businesses to go online, we're introducing a special tax reduction. For the next 3 years, any small business buying computers or investing in e-commerce and new information technologies will be able to immediately write off against tax the full 100% costs in the year of purchase. And side by side with this incentive, the Small Business Service will offer consultancy, advice and planning to help small businesses get online and become e-companies. And with the additional resources my friend the Secretary for Employment is providing to the University for Industry, which starts this autumn, it will be able to offer small business employees training on the internet. We are determined to lead in e-commerce and in the internet, and today we're introducing new rules for work permits in areas of highly skilled information technology where there is a global shortage. To promote the use of the internet, we will legislate for other tax cuts, a 100% tax cut for electronic filing of tax and VAT returns, a further £50 tax cut for electronic filing for those paying the Working Families Tax Credit. Tax cuts since 1997 are worth £1 billion now a year for small businesses alone. And after today's measures, Britain now has the lowest small business corporation taxes we have ever had. They are the lowest in the industrialised world. Since 1997, for small companies, there has been an average tax cut of almost 25%. And to encourage the next generation of entrepreneurs, we as a government are forming a partnership with the CBI, the Institute of Directors and Chambers of Commerce to encourage enterprise in all communities. 2 new enterprise funds will target business loans and management scholarships to high unemployment areas. So stage by stage, we are moving from the Britain where enterprise was a closed circle for the few to a Britain where enterprise will be open to all. We must also remove the old barriers of underinvestment and neglect that have held too long our regions back. And working with the new regional development agencies and the Small Business Service, our aim is balanced economic development across all the regions and nations of the UK, with a modern regional policy supporting local innovation, investment and improved infrastructure. To finance a network of regional venture capital investment funds, we are today announcing a partnership with the European Investment Bank and the private sector, with a target of £1 billion for new economic development for our regions and nations. The regional targets will be 85 million for the South West, 120 million for the North West, 130 million for the North East and Yorkshire, 250 million for the Midlands and East, 250 million for London and the South East, and Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland will have their own funds. And to further promote a modern regional policy, the Secretary for Industry will be announcing a regional innovation fund to facilitate the formation of local clusters in high-tech industries. For years, Britain has lagged behind America in business access to venture capital investment. It is only half as much per head here as in the United States, and I'm grateful to Mr. Paul Miners, who has agreed to head a review of institutional investment to report to me in time for the next budget. Our goal for the whole of the United Kingdom is to remove the old barriers to full employment. We know that greater opportunity for all means greater prosperity also for all. And since 1997, the number of unemployed on benefits has fallen by 30%. Youth unemployment is down 70%. 200,000 young people have now found jobs. Long-term youth unemployment, which in the mid-80s was 500,000, even in 1997 was as high as 200,000, is already down to 50,000. The New Deal demonstrates how false was the old choice between enterprise and fairness, between efficiency and equality. By delivering employment opportunity for all, we are making Britain more enterprising and more fair, to the benefit not just of the high unemployment areas, but to the benefit of the whole country. And because we have succeeded in this Parliament in removing all barriers to employing the young, I can announce that starting from April next year, we will extend the opportunities and obligations of the New Deal to the long-term adult unemployed, with 4 options: work-based training, work experience, including in the voluntary sector, and self-employment, but no 5th option, no staying at home on benefit, doing nothing. The relationship we are forging between rights and responsibilities is firmly rooted in both economic opportunity and individual responsibility. Instead of being left to draw benefit at a social security office, unemployed who are able to work will sign on to seek work, with the long-term unemployed offered the help of a personal employment advisor, and to ease the transition back to work, a new job grant starting at £100 and help with rent or mortgage. Instead of benefits paying more than work, work will pay, and we will extend the principle of the Working Families Tax Credit. From April the 1st, as a first stage, all long-term unemployed over 50 who want to return to work will be guaranteed a minimum income for the first year back. For wages of up to £15,000 a year, an extra payment of £60 a week. And building on the forthcoming rise in the national minimum wage, I'm today also increasing the Working Families Tax Credit. It is already being paid to 1 million families in our country. And with today's family tax cut, the minimum family income will rise next April from £200 a week by 7% to £214 a week. Full employment is not just about the right to work, but where there are jobs, the responsibility and requirement to do so. So we will implement the report of Lord Grabiner QC. Starting in May, a confidential phone line will advise claimants on how to move from the hidden economy and end fraudulent benefit or tax claims, how to get work, register as a business or become self-employed. After 6 months, from 1st January, for those who fail to respond, tougher rules and penalties will be imposed. And from October, in the 20 highest unemployment areas of Britain, covering 120,000 unemployed, local special action teams will be set up to help local unemployed people into nearby vacancies. The number of lone parents on income support has fallen by almost 100,000 since 1997, but the employment rate amongst lone parents in Britain is still only 45%, far below the 70 to 80% rates of America, France, Scandinavia. And in this budget, we also remove all barriers to work and can today announce an extension of the New Deal in a new way to 500,000 lone parents. Piloted from this autumn, starting nationally from next April, lone parents with children over 5 will be invited to work-focused interviews, encouraged to take up new choices, the choice to train for work with a new cash payment of £15 a week on top of benefits for training, the choice of a few hours work a week with the first £20 of earnings allowed with no reduction in benefit, the choice of part-time work with a guaranteed £155 for 16 hours of work, or the choice of full-time work on a guaranteed £214 a week. And on every rung of this ladder of opportunity, there will be help with back-to-work costs and with childcare. Just as we remove all barriers to lone parents working when their children go to school, so we will also help mothers who want to be at home in the first months of their child's life. Today, too many children are born into poverty because the family income drops when the mother stops work. Yet this is the time when many mothers feel they need to be at home with a young child. The Secretary for Trade is announcing today he will review what improvements can be made in maternity pay and parental leave to improve family-friendly employment. Today, I can announce immediate decisions which recognise the extra costs families face when a child is born. For all low-income mothers who meet the basic requirement of health check-ups for their young child, we'll increase the maternity grant from £200 to £300, helping over 200,000 low-income mothers. Mothers on paid maternity leave who would otherwise fall into income support will now stay on Working Families Tax Credit. Families receiving the credit where the mother wants to stay at home will no longer have to wait as long as 6 months for additional support after the child is born, and this support will be worth up to £30 a week for a mother. I've examined the alternative that has been put to me of a transferable tax allowance for husbands and wives when mothers stay at home. Under this system, a family with 2 children on £15,000 a year would receive £965 a year. The Working Families Tax Credit is far better. With the improvements in it announced today, the same couple would not receive £965 a year, but £2,200 a year. The Prime Minister has set a national goal for our country to abolish child poverty in 20 years and to halve it by 2010. A sure start for all Britain's children is not only right, but it is the best anti-crime, the best anti-drugs, the best anti-unemployment, the best anti-dependency policy for this country's future. Our strategy starts from the foundation of universal child benefit for all 7 million families with children. When we came to office, child benefit was just £11.05 for the first child. Child benefit will now be £15.50 from April 2001, 40% more than in 1997. For young children in the poorest families, weekly support in 1997 was just £28. We have raised that in every budget, and today the Social Security Secretary is announcing a further increase for poorest children of £4.35 a week. So maximum support is up from the £28 of 1997 to up to £50 a week next year. As a result of all our measures, the poorest 2-child family on income support will be £1,500 a year better off. The low-paid family with 2 children on a wage of £10,000 will now be £2,700 a year better off. This is what we mean by tackling child poverty and making work pay. I can now report that the numbers of children lifted out of poverty this year will rise beyond 1 million and next year reach 1.2 million children. It is the greatest reduction in child poverty in 50 years, and our country is now at last fulfilling this generation's obligations to the next. As we move forward to take the 2 million children out of poverty, I can confirm that the Social Security Secretary and I have agreed on the next major reform. Over the next 3 years, building on the foundation of universal child benefit, we will create an integrated and seamless system of support for children paid to the mother. The war against child poverty needs more than finance, and it needs more than the efforts of government alone. It can only be won by the combined efforts of private, voluntary, charitable and public sectors all working together. After consultation with charities and voluntary organisations, we will proceed to set up in every region of our country, and with cash allocated in our spending review, not just one children's fund, but a network of local and regional children's funds to support work by the voluntary sector in meeting the needs of children. A strong civic society is built not by rights alone, but by rights and responsibilities, and by the shared pursuit of the common good, which every year in this country enlists the energies and realises the idealism of more than 22 million citizens. It is time for government to do more to extend and encourage this civic patriotism. All voluntary organisations and charities will benefit from the tax reforms we're announcing to make it easier to give money and to give time. From 6 April this year, for every pound any taxpayer gives to charity, the government will add an extra 28 pence. To encourage payroll giving, for every pound contributed through the pay packet, the government will add up to 50 pence worth of tax relief. Tax relief will be available not just for cash donations, but for gifts of shares. To encourage corporate giving, any company from April the 1st can receive tax relief on the full amount of any donation. Within prescribed limits, I will go further in exempting ticket sales for charitable fundraising events from VAT, so that the contributions people make will go straight to the charities they support. And each of these measures will also help those charities and non-governmental organisations who, with the churches, have for decades led the crusade to combat third world poverty and secure debt relief. With these reforms, the government matches their commitment because it shares their cause, which is a virtuous circle of debt reduction, poverty relief and economic development for the poorest countries of the world. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a strong civic society takes seriously its obligations to our elderly, to the very poor pensioners whom we must help out of poverty, to those just above benefit levels whose lifetime savings should not, as in the past, be a barrier to securing a better retirement income, and to those who, while better off, are on fixed incomes. The Secretary for Social Security is to launch a consultation on how, for the next Parliament, we can develop a new pensioners' credit, designed not only to lift pensioners out of poverty, but also to do more for those with modest occupational pensions and those with savings who should not be penalised for having worked hard all their lives and saved for their retirement. Under the framework in which we will consult, an older pensioner with income, for example, of £100 or less a week, or a couple with less than £150 a week, would qualify for a credit to raise their income. And we will consult, and while we consult on this reform, we will also make immediate changes. The pensioners' tax allowance will be set this year at £5,790, and for those over 75 at £6,050, and nearly 6 million pensioners will not pay any income tax at all. With the new 10 pence rate on savings, 1.5 million pensioners will for the first time pay tax at half the rate of the past, at 10 pence and not 20 pence. And I've decided to do more today for elderly citizens with modest savings whose thrift has perversely and unfairly debarred them from receiving the income they need. For years, any pensioner with savings over £3,000 has lost out on income support. The last government froze the limit at £3,000 in 1988. I have decided from next April that we will double this limit, raising it from £3,000 to £6,000. The cut-off point for income support was frozen at £8,000 of savings in 1990. We will raise that to £12,000. As a result, 500,000 elderly men and women previously penalised for the thrift and savings will be on average £250 a year better off. Many will be better off by £1,000 a year. Now, fuel poverty has scarred our country for too long. That's why in our first budget we cut VAT on fuel, why in the second budget the winter allowance was introduced at £20, and then in our third budget it was raised to £100, available to all 8.5 million households with a resident over 60. Under this government, the winter allowance will be paid this year, and it will be paid every year. I've considered whether to raise the allowance in line with inflation, which would put it up by £3 to £103, or in line with earnings, which would raise it to £104.50. I've decided in this budget not to raise it by £4 or even £5, but to raise it by £50 to £150. This winter allowance at £150 will now cover up to 4 winter months of a hard-pressed pensioner's fuel bill. I can also announce that 600,000 of our elderly will benefit from the new Affordable Warmth programme to install fuel-efficient central heating in 1 million homes throughout Britain. Beginning on 1st November, all pensioners over 75 will receive the free TV licence worth £104, and I can announce that any pensioner over 75 who has an unexpired licence which runs beyond November the 1st will be eligible for a refund for every unexpired month. These new measures will complement next year's rise in the retirement pension. Based on forecast rates of inflation, we can expect that the pension rise in April 2001 will be more than £2 for single pensioners and over £3 for couples. Of all the measures to lift our poorest pensioners out of poverty, the minimum income guarantee is the most essential. We will raise it in line with earnings next year. For a single pensioner, it will be worth £82 a week. For those over 80, £90 a week. For couples, £127, and those over 80, £137. Taking these measures together, the winter allowance, the TV licence, the higher minimum guarantee, by April next year, 1 million pensioners in our country, compared with 1997, will be £20 a week or £1,000 a year better off. Yeah. Now, as we look to the future, I want to be able to achieve the security for all of a wealth-owning democracy, with prosperity reaching the people and the places the economy has too long forgotten. We want to do more to help people start a bank account and start saving, more to help people invest in their pension, more to help people get on the first rung of the savings ladder and make provision for the future. Today in Britain, unfortunately, up to 3.5 million adults have no bank account at all. The Cruikshank report has revealed a basic affordable bank account would be profitable for the banks, and that using banking facilities and not the cash economy just to pay gas and electricity bills alone could save families £50 a year or £1 a week. So I'm now inviting the banks and the post office to work together to offer this basic banking service to all. And I want working families to be able to move seamlessly from starting an account to starting to save. I've already announced measures to reward pensioners' savings. This year, 6.5 million individual savings accounts have already been started. For the coming year, the ceiling was announced at £5,000 of savings. Instead, for one more year, I will keep the ceiling at £7,000. I said last November that I would in future make an annual budget decision on one matter: real terms rises in road fuel duties. The money to go to a new ring-fence fund for roads and public transport. Since the pre-budget report, world oil prices have risen rapidly from $23 to $30 a barrel. So in this budget, I decided that beyond the automatic inflation rise of 2 pence a litre, there will be no real terms rise in road fuel duties. To encourage the use of ultra-low sulphur petrol, I will set that fuel duty at 1 pence per litre below other petrol from 1st October. An extension to the new lower rate vehicle excise duty comes in on March the 1st next year. Until that date, and for the rest of this year, I've decided for all cars to freeze vehicle excise duty. At present, the lower rate at £55 below the standard rate is available for 1.5 million cars. From next year, I will extend the reduced rate of vehicle excise duties to cars at 1,200 cc's or below. This will cut vehicle excise duty to £105 for 2.2 million additional cars, and the reduced rate will now cover almost 4 million cars. I'm also introducing from 1st March next year for newly purchased cars a 4-band vehicle excise duty rewarding the most environmentally friendly vehicles. Under the rates I'm publishing this afternoon, 95% of new cars will pay less than they would under the current vehicle excise duty system. Half of them will pay at least £30 below the current duty. We will also cut the vehicle excise duty for 40,000 38-tonne and 41-tonne lorries by £500. The 40-tonne class lorries will have their rate cut by £1,800. For all other heavy lorries, rates will be frozen. The environmental impact of these tax cuts, taken together with the revenue-neutral proposal for company cars, will be a reduction in carbon emissions of 1 million tonnes by 2010, helping to meet the Kyoto targets negotiated by my friend, the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, this is on top of the 5 million tonnes reduction in carbon emissions by 2010 as a result of the climate change levy, which is also revenue neutral and on which the Financial Secretary is publishing further details today. To further cut pollution, we will legislate the aggregates levy, which will again be made revenue neutral through a further 0.1% cut in employers' national insurance. These two measures taken together cut employers' national insurance by £1.35 billion. There is also a strong environmental case for reducing stamp duty for development of brownfield sites, as recommended by the Rogers report, and the Paymaster General will now consult in detail on this measure. For the property market, in addition to the previously announced withdrawal of mortgage interest tax relief, stamp duty on property sales will be raised for sales above £250,000 to 3% and for sales above £500,000 to 4%. For properties below £250,000, I propose no change and also propose to freeze insurance tax. Last year, I froze duties on all spirits. This year, an inflation rise would push the price of whisky up by 22 pence a bottle. Because of the competitive position of the spirits industry, I will this year continue to freeze duty on all spirits. Beer will rise only by inflation, 1 pence a pint. Wine only by inflation, 4 pence a bottle. Now that the return leg exemption for airfares has been found in breach of single market law, I'm taking the opportunity to introduce a new fairer and lower air passenger duty at an overall cost to the Exchequer of £80 million. The tax on economy flights within the UK will be the same or lower. For economy flights outside Europe, the rate will remain at £20. There will be a new business class rate of £40. 30 million economy passengers travelling to Europe will have air passenger duty cut in half, from £10 to £5. And on flights from the Scottish Highlands and Islands, I'm abolishing air passenger duty altogether. On tobacco, the Paymaster General will tomorrow announce tough new measures to tackle smuggling. Cigarette tax will rise by 5% above inflation from tonight, by 25 pence a packet, with every penny of the extra revenue going, as I promised, to funding our hospitals and the National Health Service. And I'm also commissioning a long-term assessment of technological, demographic and medical trends over the next 2 decades that will affect the health service, to report to the Treasury in time for the start of the next spending review in 2002. I have a number of other fiscal decisions to make. Debt interest payments are down by £4 billion a year. And because we have not spent and we will not spend more at the expense of being prudent, we've also made the tough decisions to tackle benefit fraud, to move people from welfare to work, and to control the social security budget. Social security spending, which grew by nearly 4% a year in the last Parliament, will grow by less than 1% a year in this Parliament. In fact, compared to last year's budget forecast, social security spending is lower this year by £2 billion and will be another £2 billion lower next year, a saving of £4 billion in all. Because we have cut borrowing and because we have reformed the welfare state, cutting the costs of social and economic failure, our financial discipline has made extra resources available for our priorities. And, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a budget is about priorities. In my pre-budget consultations, I've read carefully detailed budget representations, and I've examined proposals from all sides of the House, including one from the current Shadow Chancellor, who on the 6th of March, and I quote, said, "He can either reduce taxes or increase public spending. What I would recommend is that he use the money to reduce taxes." I've examined proposals for transferable tax allowances costing £4.25 billion, private health insurance tax reliefs at £500 million, for abolishing capital gains tax at £3.9 billion, top-rate tax cuts at £690 million for every 1 pence. And I've established that for these last two alone, 75% of such tax cuts would go to the wealthiest 5% of the population and leave us nothing extra for public services like the National Health Service. And because such proposals have been made irrespective of the economic circumstances, they would risk a return to boom and bust. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have decided instead on a prudent and responsible approach that allows us to repay debt and to lock in an even greater fiscal tightening, and it allows us, even after meeting all our fiscal rules, to target tax cuts on hard-working families and to release for our public services in the coming year alone additional resources of £4 billion. These extra resources are not at the expense of our prudence, they arise because of our prudence. So I can announce an immediate new investment of £280 million in transport, £250 million of it to a ring-fence fund for improving roads and public transport, including transport in rural areas. The Deputy Prime Minister will be making a statement on individual allocations for the coming year later this week. I'm able to announce an additional £285 million to be spent from April for fighting crime, and later this week the Home Secretary will announce further details. I'm also able to announce additional investment in UK education starting on the 1st of April of an additional £1 billion. Under the Secretary for Education and Employment's leadership, class size for 5 to 7-year-olds in primary schools are being cut and significant improvements in reading, writing and maths achieved. Last year, he made a payment for every primary school for books of £2,000. Now this year, cash also will go directly into the classroom. To support his drive for literacy and numeracy, every one of the country's 18,000 primary schools will from April the 1st receive a new payment for books, equipment and staffing of £3,000 for the smallest school, rising to £9,000 for schools with more than 200 pupils. And this money will go straight to the head teacher. Schools offering special tuition to help the weakest pupils catch up will be able to draw on an extra £20 million to boost pupil results. The Secretary of State is also proposing to back up reforms in secondary school with new measures to boost the performance of those falling behind and to raise the performance of all pupils by the age of 14. To support these reforms in our secondary schools, he will now make a payment to every head teacher for books, equipment and staffing. Last year, we were able to make an extra payment for books and equipment of £2,000. This April, every one of these 3,500 secondary schools will receive a minimum payment of £30,000 and for schools with over 1,000 pupils, £50,000. This is £300 million in new investment through these measures alone, money paid direct to the school for use in the classroom. And to advance our goal of 50% of young people in higher education, the Secretary for Education is announcing that 3 times as many 16-year-olds will from this autumn benefit from the new educational maintenance allowances worth up to £30 a week to persuade people to stay on at school, and next month he will launch a national campaign to raise school staying on rates. And further announcements on the full allocation of additional monies for education will be made by the Secretary of State on Thursday, by the Scottish and Welsh administrations and the Northern Ireland Secretary. But I can announce that for the year from 1st April, the real terms rise in the UK's educational expenditure will next year be 8%. Now, after these new spending decisions, I have a decision to make on income tax. Our prudent approach allows us to repay debt, invest in public services, and cut taxes for hard-working families. So I will proceed from 6 April with our 1 pence cut in the basic rate of income tax from 23 pence to 22 pence, the lowest basic tax rate for 70 years. And I am also combining this cut in income tax with a further direct tax cut, a family tax cut. Next April, for 5 million families with children, the new children's tax credit will be increased from £416 to £442. For those families, this credit will now be worth twice as much as the old married couples allowance it replaces. And it reduces the family bill from next April by a total of £8.50 a week, on top of rises in child benefit. Taken with the 10p income tax rate, the 22p basic rate, the normal indexation of tax allowances and thresholds, next year's tax burden for the working family will be the lowest since 1972, a fall from the 21.5% of income we inherited to 18.8%. As I said, a budget is about priorities. A choice has been posed in these last few months between investing in a national health service financed by public expenditure with access based on need, and privatised healthcare dependent on private insurance. This government is committed to a publicly funded national health service true to the original principle of its founders. And securing the long-term future of the NHS is one of the great challenges this country must and will meet. Tomorrow, the Prime Minister will make a statement to this House on the work he and the Health Secretary will lead over the next 4 months on reforms and modernisation of the health service. The Government's plan, to be published in July, alongside the detailed public spending allocations, will address long-standing variations in efficiency, performance and health outcomes and the right balance between preventative, primary and hospital care. And now that the overall public spending total is set for the years until 2004, I've decided that we can back long-term reform with long-term resources for the health service by today announcing the NHS allocations not just for 1 year, but for the next 4 years. Since its creation, national health spending has risen by an average of 3.3% a year above inflation. Under the last government, it rose by 2.9%. We have decided that in the years from now until 2004, the NHS will grow by twice as much, by 6.1% a year, over and above inflation, by far the largest sustained increase in NHS funding in any period in its 50-year history. Last year, the equivalent of just over £1,850 per household was spent on the NHS. By 2004, more than £2,800 per household will be spent, half as much again for healthcare for every family in the country. In the last year alone, there has been an increase of 4,500 in nurses working in the health service. This is just a start. With today's extra resources and the reforms still to come, we can plan next year and the year after to recruit at least 10,000 more nurses, and with new money announced today, we will train and recruit even more in the years to come. Now let us emphasise that more resources must mean more reform and modernisation. The Prime Minister, in his statement to the House tomorrow, will set out how, with the guarantee of sustained investment, the government, the professions and the whole of the NHS can come together to rise to the challenge of delivering better health care for all. But I can make one further announcement. In 10 days' time, at the beginning of the new financial year, the NHS was scheduled to have a £2.9 billion addition on last year. I've decided that we should raise that figure with immediate effect by allocating not only the £300 million in tobacco revenues I promised last autumn, but by adding to that to achieve in total an extra £2 billion, making a rise next year of £4.9 billion, extra money the NHS can start using from the 1st of April. So health service spending will rise from last year's £45.1 billion, this year's £49.3 billion, to next year £54.2 billion, the year after that £58.6 billion, then £63.5 billion, and then from April 2003, £68.7 billion. Over these 5 years, a cash increase of 50%, a real terms increase of 35%. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is new money we can provide because we have made our choice. It is a budget that unites the whole country. It is a budget for all the people. We have been prudent for a purpose, a stronger, fairer Britain, and I commend this budget to the House.
Order. 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 Understanding order number 51, the first motion, entitled Provisional Collection of Taxes, must be decided without debate. The version that I will be putting to the House is on a single sheet headed Revised, and not the one in the main booklet of resolutions. Will the Chancellor of the Exchequer please move formally? The question is that, pursuant to Section 5 of the Provisional Collection of Taxes Act 1968, provisional statutory effect shall be given to the following motions. A. Hydrocarbon oils, rates of duty and rebate, motion number 5. B. Tobacco products, rates of duty, motion number 10. C. Vehicle excise duty, rates for goods, vehicles, etc., motion number 17. D. Disposals of assets for which a VAT repayment is claimed, motion number 19. As many as that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I shall now call order. I shall now call upon the Chancellor of the Exchequer to move the motion entitled Amendment of the Law, and it is on that motion that the debate will take place today and on the succeeding days. The remaining motions will not be put until the end of the budget debate next week, and they will then be decided without debate. Will the Chancellor please move the Amendment of the Law motion? The question is that it is expedient to amend the law with respect to the national debt and the public revenue, and to make further provision in connection with finance. But this resolution does not extend to the making of any amendment with respect to value-added tax so as to provide A, for zero rating or exempting a supply, acquisition or importation, B, for refunding an amount of tax, C, for varying any rate at which that tax is at any time chargeable, or D, for any relief other than a relief which, 1, so far as it is applicable to goods, applies to goods of every description, and 2, so far as it is applicable to services, applies to services of every description. Mr. William Hague.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as ever, I congratulate the Chancellor on his delivery of the speech. And last year, I seem to remember that I compared him to meeting a man in a pub who says, "Lend me a fiver and I will buy you a drink." This year, he actually did borrow a fiver in order to buy his own breakfast this morning in the Treasury. And that makes a serious point, that much of the money that people pay in taxes disappears into the Chancellor's pockets without being used for any practical benefit for anyone else at all. And I have no doubt that we will see more of that after this budget today. Now, his budgets have tended to follow something of a pattern, in which the Chancellor gives his account of the budget, which, to put it charitably, is often incomplete, we have discovered on previous occasions. Everybody behind him then plays the role of the useful idiot in cheering in the naive belief. Cheering in the naive belief that they have got the full picture. And then it turns out a few days later or a few hours later that the full picture is rather different. This year we have seen, in the last few minutes, elements of the Red Book, and they show many things that the Chancellor did not allude to in his speech. For instance, there weren't many figures on the tax burden in the speech that he just delivered, were there? And it turns out, for instance, yes, well, he said it was falling last time, and then it turned out not to be the case, as the Prime Minister's press secretary has now revealed. There's no point in now claiming that it is falling. It turns out in the Red Book that the savings ratio has been revised downwards again, and then after being 5.75% in this year, it's now to be 5.5% in the next year, much less than in the pre-budget report. And of course, that is one of the reasons that interest rates are higher than they would otherwise be, why the pound is higher than it would otherwise be, and why the balance of payments deficit is higher than it otherwise be, which the Red Book shows, and the Chancellor failed to inform the House. That deficit is set to grow from 15.5 billion to 28.25 billion over the next 3 years. There was a time when such figures would have featured in the speech of the Chancellor when he gave the budget to this House, but they do not feature in the speeches of this Chancellor, who gives a selective account of the budget to the House and to the nation. It was interesting, too, that when he gave the forecast figures for growth over the next 2 years and referred to business investment growing by 7.75% this year, that he then stopped reading out the figures for the next year on business investment, and that's because the growth falls from 7.75% to 2.5% next year. Why was he curiously unable to read out that figure, having read out the comparable figure for the next year on every other parameter on which he chose to to comment. And that showed productivity growth slowing down and business investment flattening out and declining as a share of GDP after 6 years of growth. So one thing we know for sure, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that the account of the totality of the measures that we have heard is incomplete. And the most cursory analysis for a few minutes of the booklets that come out with the budget show that to be the case. Now, he stood up to address the House as a tax-raising Chancellor, and he sat down as a tax-raising Chancellor, and he sat down as the stealth Chancellor who taxes more and delivers less. And nothing the Chancellor said in his speech will stop the £4.5 billion of new taxes set to hit people next month, which have already been announced in the previous budgets, or at least in the documents which accompanied previous budgets. A £4.5 billion total of new stealth taxes heading people's way in a few weeks' time. And of course it comes on top of a lot of previous tax announcements. So any reductions announced today pale into insignificance beside the huge increases already in place or in the pipeline. The Chancellor is like a mugger who grabs your money and then wants you to thank him for giving you your bus fare in order to get home. And at the same time as he has done that, hospital waiting lists have risen, police numbers have fallen, class sizes are up, the asylum controls have collapsed, and the transport system is at a standstill. Now, as usual, today's budget included one or two re-announcements, such as the re-announcement of the 1 pence reduction in the rate of income tax. He enjoyed re-announcing that. But what about re-announcing the abolition of the married couples allowance that costs people £200 a year from next month? What about re-announcing the abolition of tax relief on mortgages that cost families £225 a year next month? What about re-announcing to millions of single-earner married couples with a mortgage that they'll be paying more income tax next year, even with the cut in the basic rate? What about re-announcing the imposition of national insurance on benefits in kind, such as health insurance? What about re-announcing in that speech all the other new taxes that people in this country are now paying as a result of his activities? The pensions tax, more savings tax, fuel duty increases, taxes on charities, rises in stamp duty, abolition of tax relief on health insurance for pensioners, higher taxes on smokers and drinkers, increases in gaming duty, and increased taxes of many other kinds. Why didn't they? Where were they? Why didn't they feature in the speech which he has just delivered? But then he talks to see me with great authority about e-commerce and the internet, about promoting enterprise and competing in the internet age. But his new stealth tax on self-employed contractors is destroying all of that. That tax never appeared in this budget, or indeed in the last budget. It is known as IR35 because it only ever appeared as Inland Revenue Press Release number 35. And it is a £475 million tax on our future, driving many high-tech businesses abroad. I received a letter the other day from one of the people with such a business who says, and I'll send the Chancellor the letter, he says, I am in the process of closing down the company because IR35 has damaged my business to the extent it isn't worth continuing in business anymore. He's not listening because he doesn't like to listen to the truth about what his policies do to people. This man says he should listen to people actually in business because he's never actually worked in a business for a single day in his life. He says, in fact, my financial advisor told me that something like 70 of his existing clients are either leaving the United Kingdom or seeking other ways of making a living. He is the first man since Lord Healey to create a brain drain in this country. So he talks about e-commerce and the internet, but he taxes those businesses and drives them out of Britain. He talked about charities too, and of course I welcome his decision to increase tax breaks for charities. Although, as ever with him, we'll need to look carefully at the detail. But it speaks volumes about this Chancellor and this government that even charities have found that while he gives with one hand, he has taken more away with the other. And in the light of the tax increases on charities, dividend tax credit changes and other tax rises, the Chief Executive of Barnardo's has said, we applaud Mr. Brown's commitment to a new age of giving, but feel that many corporate and individual donors would be surprised to learn just how much of their contributions are now being clawed back by the government. So for everyone else it is a new age of giving, but for the Chancellor, taking together his budgets and their impact on charities, it is an age of taking, and taking again. He talked about, last year he announced the abolition of the married couples allowance. He's also announced it will be replaced by the children's tax credit, and he made further announcements about that today. Yet the replacement comes in a year after the thing it is replacing has gone. And today the Chancellor has done nothing to address that problem. So we now have a new definition of the gap year for people. This is a gap year for parents and for children. And even the Deputy Prime Minister wouldn't be very happy with the train operating company that phased out the 9:15 to Waterloo a year before it phased in the replacement bus service. But that is what is now going on with the Chancellor. So the Chancellor is taxing more and delivering less. And that is why taxes are going up, and no amount of weasel words and government spin and stealth taxes can disguise the truth. The tax burden in Britain is rising and will continue to rise. The OECD now describes it as the fastest rising tax burden in the industrial world. The Institute of Fiscal Studies says there is no question that UK taxes are rising. There is no way Labour can get the tax burden back down to the level it was at the beginning of this Parliament. And even the Fabian Society says the government may like to emphasise its headline tax cuts, but in fact the overall burden of taxation has risen since it came to power. So he says the tax burden is now falling. He said it just after I started my speech. But he's been saying that for the last 3 years, when we now know that it wasn't true. And no amount of fiddling the official figures can hide the fact that the overall tax burden is much higher than when they came to power. Now, he claimed today to be cutting taxes and increasing spending on public services. This will come as news to the Prime Minister, who said for months that it is an impossibility to do those things at the same time. But so, of course, he has torpedoed the argument that the Prime Minister often uses across this dispatch box. But maybe he was only getting his revenge for what the Prime Minister and his press secretary did to the Chancellor a few days ago. Because every time before that, whenever the Chancellor was in trouble, he claimed, like he claimed a few moments ago, to be actually cutting taxes. But last week, the Prime Minister's press secretary blurted out the truth. And thanks to his decision to hold lobby briefings on the record now, I have a transcript from last Tuesday. The press secretary begins, "Please don't ask me complicated questions about tax." And that he takes the lead from his boss, the Prime Minister. But then he actually came clean when figures were put to him showing that the tax burden was rising. And his actual words are worth listening to. He said, "Yeah, those are the figures as set out in the last PBR, either budget or whatever, Red Book, the projections. Had they been, yeah, I don't know, whatever." That's what he said. Now, that is how the Prime Minister's press secretary conceded that the tax burden was rising. And it is no consolation that the real Deputy Prime Minister is no more eloquent than the official one. That is what he actually came out with. Now let's have a look at some of the other things that he's put forward in the budget. He made, of course, a lot of announcements about public spending on health and education. And let me say, so they don't try to distort the position of the opposition again in the future, that we unambiguously welcome the new money for hospitals and schools, new money which we were always able to find in government. Asking me to give way.
Order. I'll deal with this. There's no need for the honourable gentleman to persist on his feet. It's quite clear the right honourable gentleman is not giving way, and indeed it is not customary to give way at this stage of the debate.
Well, we're happy to change the custom if the Chancellor will give way during budgets in future, and then we could correct him as he goes along instead of having to correct him afterwards, which is what happens now. That would be the basis on which we'd give way at the moment. But we've all learnt from bitter experience not to take this Chancellor's budget soundbites at face value, and we'll examine very carefully all the announcements about public services that he has made today. Because we know all about his triple accounting, how 2 + 2 = 12 for 3 years. And £21 billion extra health spending turns out, when you look at the figures in his previous announcements, to be £3 billion a year for 3 years. So we know that his announcements occasionally grab their headlines on budget night, but they often leave a sour taste in the mouth of doctors and nurses and patients whose expectations are raised and then dashed, and who see the waiting lists get longer and longer. As the chief executive of the respected King's Fund said last week on Panorama, I think it's very misleading. It's the wrong way of actually presenting these figures. I've never seen it done before, and I have to say it's not just the NHS, it's in education and other spending areas where they've done the same thing. And then there's the Chancellor's other favourite trick, the constant re-announcement of government spending, and we'll have to look carefully for that in the speech that he just made. We remember the new money for IT in schools. He's been talking about that again today. But originally, money for IT in schools was announced by him in 1997, re-announced by the Education Secretary in October 97, by the Prime Minister in November 1998, and the Education Secretary again on April 99. 16 announcements of the same money, with the same gullible people falling for it every time. So there's no point making a din when being informed that you were taken for a ride on 15 separate occasions. And that is how that they tend to do these things. And after all of that, they have not delivered on their promises. 1999 was meant, of course, to be the year of delivery. And then it all turned out when a quoted Blair aide reported in The Independent on Sunday said, "Did we say 1999 was the year of delivery? It was always going to be next year when things really started to happen." And what does the Prime Minister do when faced with that reality? He orders up a round of speeches to show that the government is delivering. But no amount of speeches are going to show it when the police numbers have fallen and the waiting lists to get on the waiting list are longer and the class sizes have actually increased. Now, the Chancellor said he would meet some of this problem with his increase in tobacco duty, ring-fencing it for use in the health service. But can he confirm? Now, I have some questions to ask him about it. Occasionally, we have questions to ask which the Chancellor ought to answer. Now, can he confirm that despite increasing tax rates, tobacco duty revenue actually fell in 1998-99 to 1999-2000? And this is due, at least in part, to the increase in the amount of tobacco smuggled into the country, avoiding the payment of tax at all. He doesn't seem to have read the report of the government's smuggling czar. They now have a smuggling czar. There's so much smuggling taking place, which concluded that increased duty was a major contributory factor to increased smuggling. So his hypothecated money for the health service may be another announcement of extra money that doesn't actually arrive. If it is additional to planned health service spending, then we're entitled to ask what happens when it varies or when the amount is lower than was expected. If it is not additional, then what is he going on about? And it is a sad comment on his failure to deliver that he now has to rely on the hypothecation of taxes to try to persuade people that the money is actually going somewhere useful, which he has failed to persuade them in the past. He had more to say about his tax credit programme, a programme so complicated now that I think he's hoping that nobody else will understand it. His repeated announcements always impress Labour members of Parliament, but as we've seen in recent elections, they haven't impressed Labour voters very much, who, it turns out, are not as stupid as their members of Parliament. And Labour voters have listened to all this stuff about reviewing the proposed integration of his integrated proposals, and they've seen through it and cut to the bottom line. And the bottom line, very frequently, is that his complexity and confusion costs them and it costs businesses. He won't explain it to the House, so let me. By replacing family credit with the Working Families Tax Credit, he has ensured that 250,000 families face marginal rates of tax and benefit withdrawal of more than 60%, more than 60 pence in the pound. By extending the means testing of the Working Families Tax Credit, he's produced a benefit so poorly targeted that it can be claimed by upper-rate taxpayers. And by replacing married couples' allowance with children's tax credit, he's made sure that no families pay tax at his much-trumpeted 10p lower tax rate. So his entire system not only refuses to recognise marriage, but is systematically biased against one-earner couples who are not entitled to childcare credit. His claims about tax credits, just like his claims about the New Deal, ring very hollow. His own figures show that fewer lone parents found work through the pilot New Deal for lone parents than in the comparison areas where the New Deal was not actually being put into practice. So no wonder the heartlands are rather unimpressed by this. It's only some people in here who actually live in the fantasy world in which anything the Chancellor announces actually happens. Some of them actually believe that all of these things that he stands there on Budget Day and talks about actually then get delivered to the voters. But the voters know best. And it is left to the front bench opposite to live in this fantasy world where everything is being delivered and the dome is a great success and everybody wants to join the euro and everybody wants to get rid of Section 28, and no doubt they saw Elvis in the supermarket last night, and no doubt some of the people sitting behind him, if he did say he'd seen Elvis in the supermarket, some of them would run out and issue a press release saying that they'd seen him too. That is the gullibility about these budgets. Now, actually, she's one of the less gullible ones, so let's not taunt the honourable member. Now, he talked about the Eurobond market, and as he has been told many times, forcing the Eurobond market to exchange information with foreign tax authorities will still be extremely damaging to that huge market in the City of London. The Chancellor has rightly rejected that option before, so why is he agreeing to it now? He announced new schemes for businesses and he claimed to be delivering a budget for enterprise. And there are a few claims that deserve to be listened to with more scepticism than that. Because each time he delivers a so-called budget for enterprise, he increases burdens on business and has done so hugely on past occasions. Last year, he said he was providing tax cuts for businesses in his budget, yet the British Chambers of Commerce estimated that the truth was that that budget alone contained £3.2 billion of tax increases for the remainder of the Parliament. And last year, the Prime Minister even had the brass neck to say that business taxes have come down under this government. To which the CBI President responded, the government has introduced a series of well-camouflaged taxes which have put the tax burden firmly onto business. Changes by the Chancellor will push up business taxation by almost £5 billion a year for the first 5 years of a Labour government. So when people hear what the Chancellor said about business, they remember the £30 billion of extra taxes already imposed on them, the 3,000 new regulations imposed in 1,000 days. They remember the previous budget day distortions and broken promises. They remember this, and they're probably not inclined to believe a word about budgets for enterprise. And we've seen him announce today, or at least we've seen him refer to, because he obviously didn't think the House merited having the details described to it, his reforms of his energy tax, the climate change levy. And the irony is that the great reforms of this Chancellor are now directed towards a tax he himself announced only a year ago. And the reason why he is now reforming his own tax that he only announced 12 months ago is that it contained what he was pleased to call in his pre-budget statement, practical constraints. In plain English, it didn't work. And in fact, there was never any chance of it working. The tax, as originally conceived, attacked many parts of manufacturing industry, exported jobs, probably exported pollution. And I pointed this out to him, and this is why you should listen to these responses, because I pointed this out to him only a few minutes after he delivered the budget last year, and within a few weeks, his own members of Parliament pointed it out to him when they started to hear from their constituents. Eventually, the news reached the Treasury, so now we have the great reform of the year 2000 of what was actually only announced in 1999. And unfortunately, the great reform package fails to address the essential problems, in many respects makes them worse. And by introducing a tax which then needs exemptions for renewable sources of energy, as well as discounts for energy-intensive industries, he's made aspects of our tax system one more example of common sense utterly defeated by Brownian complexity. And what all makes this all so sad is that the Chancellor has fallen into complexity because he's trying to retain a stealth tax that is fundamentally unsound. And that is the story of the delivery of so much of what he has put to the House today. Now, he talked about pensioners too, but of course he forgot to remind us about some things about pensioners, which is that a person retiring after the 6th of April this year will lose married couples allowance and age-related allowance, which together were worth £500 off their tax bill. And that is taken away. They say they're keeping it for the over 65s, these allowances, but they're not keeping it for anybody who becomes 65 after April this year. And those retired couples are being attacked by his changes. And today they're supposed to be grateful to a Chancellor who offers them a variety of additional payments that are worth fractions of what they are actually going to lose, and are supposed to be grateful for being offered a study of how these things are going to be improved in the future. He's had months thinking about this. He's had months to try to deal with the problem of the increased taxes that he has imposed on pension funds, which Tesco employees are now finding out about because they have to pay an extra 1.5% on their pension contributions because his greatest tax increase of 1997 is now actually catching up with people. So the Chancellor boasts of tax cuts, but he's given with one hand and taken much more away with the other over the last 4 years. We heard plenty of figures in the Chancellor's speech. He gave out figures but didn't want us to figure out what they meant. And one figure was conspicuous by its absence: how much more tax people will be paying next year under a Labour government. But if the Chancellor won't tell people that truth, I will. The increase in the tax burden under this government, shown in his own Red Book, is the equivalent of an 8p rise in the basic rate of income tax, and that is after taking account of everything that he has announced today. After taking account of his latest announcements, it is the equivalent of an 8p rise in the basic rate of income tax. Now, for every extra pound that he's letting them keep in their pay packets, he is stealing 9 times as much from their back pockets. That is what it means in practice. So he has done what all Labour chancellors have done, to increase taxes, and the only difference is that he's much stealthier about it. Under him, taxes are 9p in the pound up and 1p down. That is the bottom line after 3 Labour budgets. That is the figure that matters. And it means the overall tax burden will have gone up by £20,000 million in his time so far as Chancellor. So this is the budget of a government that taxes more and delivers less. It has been a budget in which he has given a rosy account of the economy but forgotten about the difficulties faced by many manufacturing businesses at the moment and the crisis faced by agriculture at the moment, about which he has done nothing. And after 4 budgets, it is clear that we can see from all that he's done and all that he's failed to do that the stealth Chancellor is failing to meet the needs of this country. We needed budgets to stimulate enterprise, not take more money away from them, to make this country a lower tax magnet for investment, not drive out the high-tech entrepreneurs, to reduce regulation, not to add massively to it. We needed budgets that reformed welfare, which they have not done. Instead, we've had budgets which have seen welfare costs soar, have reduced the benefit system to a tangled mess, have totally failed to deliver better public services. We needed budgets that prepared us for an internet age, and instead we've got budgets that promote a brain drain. We needed budgets that helped communities and kept families together, and instead we've seen increased taxes on charities and the abolition of the last recognition of marriage in the tax and benefit system. We needed budgets, and we need a Chancellor, we need a government that taxes less and delivers more. And instead we have a government once again today which taxes more and delivers less.
Charles Kennedy.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I thank the Conservative benches for the warmth of the welcome this afternoon. It's very much appreciated. In congratulating the Chancellor in customary fashion, I think that it's clear that the prudence for a purpose, and it's clear what the purpose is, it's spending for a second term. The country as a whole will welcome the additional investment in the National Health Service, as we have been calling for it, where the other opposition party have not. We certainly do. But in putting that extra additional resources into the NHS, the Chancellor has, of course, given way on two of the arguments which he and the Prime Minister have used against the Liberal Democrats consistently for quite some time. The first one is, of course, that when we argued sums of this nature could and should be put into the health service, that was described as completely financially irresponsible. Today, of course, it is now the mantra. But secondly, if one thinks of the match funding controversy on Objective 1, as it affects Cornwall, Yorkshire, Merseyside, the argument used by the Chancellor consistently is that you cannot preempt the comprehensive spending review to give a commitment on match funding until that is this afternoon for the National Health Service is concerned. And therefore I think it is worth pointing out that the government makes great play of its rectitude in so many ways, but when political expediency and public pressure is brought into play, it is willing to bend. But that being the case, nonetheless, we are glad that on the National Health Service they have responded to public and political pressure, and we only regret that they did not do so after the election and sought to constrain those finances in the first half of this Parliament, and it wouldn't therefore have been necessary to such an extent to have to come forward with this package this afternoon after too many operations have been cancelled and too many patients have died in the intervening period. The second point to put about the balance of this budget on the headline figures is that about 4 times the amount of resources are being spent on tax cuts of one kind and another than are actually being invested in education generally. And that tells us a lot about the priorities of the government. Indeed, when the Chancellor drew such appreciative gasps from his own side as he detailed what the headline figures in education expenditure would mean, broken down in schools, and if one thinks that he's only devoting about £1 billion extra to education spending, if in fact the Chancellor had foregone the tax cut worth nearly £3 billion, then those examples that were cited, which you could see honourable members calculating in terms of their own constituencies, would have been treble. That's the fact of the matter. That's the fact of the matter where education spending is concerned. Thirdly, of course, there will actually be genuine anger in the country about the greatest defect of this budget. It adds insult to injury where pensioners are concerned. Absolute insult to injury. Now, what did the Chancellor actually say? He recycled a number of minor issues, minor in terms of the totality of pensioner income. He recycled them because many of those are already in the public domain. For example, the TV licences. One or two welcome moves on income support capability and £150 for the winter allowance. Marvellous. £1 a week extra for pensioners. That's what it means. £1 a week. Mind you, let us be fair to the government. £1 a week is significantly more generous than the 75 pence that the pensioners have been given. And that is what the great missing item. This is the great missing morality at the centre of this budget. Because what has he announced? What did he announce in terms of the detail of pensioners, beyond what he said today? He's going to have a consultation. Well, will that be a consultation like the Royal Commission on Care of the Elderly, which considered, reported and was effectively shelved? And by the time this consultation reports, never mind if the government choose to move in its recommendations, how many more pensioners will have passed away, will have died the result of not getting access to their hospital care or their operations or their heating? And that is the brutal truth of the matter, that simply to put forward a consultation where our pensioners are concerned, rather than direct income support action now, means that for many it will be literally too late. There's another area which did not receive great attention from the Chancellor, which was the environment, but he did promise us another consultation on brownfield taxes. Now, surely the time has come to bite the bullet as a country when it comes to environmental protection. I notice he also slipped through, in passing, when he was talking about VED, an acceptability of 40-ton plus trucks, which I think goes against what the government was saying some time ago before the last general election. So an environmental priority, I think that the government is failing badly, and that this budget proves that to be the case. One must not be too churlish. Employee share ownership is something that has long been advocated by the Liberal Party and now by the Liberal Democrats, and anything which extends its scope we will certainly welcome, although of course we want to look at the detail. And actually, at one point in the budget, when he announced that he was freezing spirit duty and getting rid of the air tax as it affects the Highlands and Islands, I really began to think we're making progress in our joint cabinet committee. It really is beginning to deliver results at last, even if not proportional representation as of yet. But I think that the priorities of the country will also be amazed that were not touched upon in a week which has seen the massive problems caused with Rover is the wider economic context, and that is the strength of the pound and the failure to give a lead on British entry into the euro. Now that is hitting manufacturing, Longbridge obviously in particular, and surely the government must accept their share of the responsibility, however the management of BMW may have acted in recent times. The uncertainty created by the fence sitting over the euro is deterring inward investment and pushing up the value of the pound. That, coupled with high interest rates, twice those of our European competitors, constitutes a double whammy. And it is worth recording that since November of last year, the trade deficit itself has doubled from 10 to 20 billion. It is a remarkable budget that makes no reference to any of those kinds of facts whatsoever. The other area that was not touched upon, which has suffered so significantly as a result of that combination of circumstances, is agriculture. I'm beginning to wonder that the Chancellor must have believed what the Prime Minister said when he went to the southwest a few weeks ago to tell an incredulous local population that in fact life in rural Britain was really going rather well. Well, that is not the case. The farming industry is in deep recession, and the fact that the Chancellor is unable to announce today, with the vast sums at his disposal, that he will not access the agri-compensatory funds available from Europe is an absolute disgrace. And it is one that these benches will continue to campaign over. So this was, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in many ways an ingenious budget, set against, in so many ways, a benign economic scenario. But for the pensioners and for the farmers and for those who care about the environment in particular, as well as for our educationalists, it will be a budget of deep disappointment. I think that this budget is one delivered with more than an eye on a general election and on the Chancellor's own political future beyond that. However, for too many, however long that timescale of political calculation will be, for them personally, particularly the elderly and the most vulnerable in our community, it will have come just too late.
Mr. Barry Jones.
Deputy Speaker, I am glad to support the budget, which I would describe as clever,